Welcome to Archive Whispers, a place to fall asleep. Settle in, lower the lights, and let the archive open. Tonight, the door we are going to open does not lead into a house, or a village, or a quiet cell, but into a bathhouse, an ordinary public bath in a small Roman town, somewhere in the long and settled afternoon of the Empire, in the 1st or 2nd century of our era. Outside, the streets are warm and dusty, and the light has begun its slow lean toward evening. Inside, behind walls of brick and marble, water is being heated in great bronze cauldrons. Lamps are waiting to be lit, and the town is preparing, as it does on every other day, to come and wash away the afternoon. We are not going to witness any of the great matters of this period. There will be no emperor here, no battle, no senate, no famous name carved into the long record of the age. We are not even going to follow a single person through the evening, for the bathhouse belongs to no one and to everyone at once, and the faces that pass through it are, for the most part, faces history never bothered to keep. Instead, we are simply going to keep company with the place itself, with its rooms and its water and its warm stone floors, across one unremarkable evening, from the hour the doors are unbarred and the bell is rung, through the heat and the steam and the slow, unhurried talk, to the moment the last lamps are carried out into the dark. I should say, before we begin, that the daily life of a Roman bath is not a thing we have had to invent. A good deal of it is known, and known well, from the people who built these places, and from the people who complained about them. The arrangement of the rooms and the furnaces we owe to Vitruvius, who set down, in his patient way, how a bath ought to be laid out so the heat would gather where it was wanted. The noise and the texture we owe, in no small part, to Seneca, who once had the misfortune to lodge in rooms directly above a bath, and who wrote a long and weary letter cataloging everything he was forced to hear. For the rest, we have leaned on the careful modern work of Fikret Yagul, of Garrett Fagan, and of Inge Nielsen. The fuller list waits in the description below, should you ever wish to walk the same warm corridors yourself. What we are going to do then is to imagine a single ordinary bathhouse on a single ordinary evening, and to move through it slowly, in something close to the order a bather himself would have followed. We will begin outside, in the dust and the last of the day's exercise, and then we will go in, out of our clothes and into the warm room, and from the warm room into the heat, and from the heat into the cold plunge, and at last out again into the cooling halls where the town sits and talks while the light fails. Nothing in particular is going to happen. That, in a sense, is rather the whole point. The bath asks nothing of the body but that it surrender to the warmth and let the warmth do its slow and patient work, and that, tonight, is very nearly all that we are going to ask of you as well. So if you are able, dim your lights now and let the room around you grow as soft and shadowed as the changing room of a bath at dusk. There is nothing here you need to follow, and nothing you need to remember. If your attention begins to wander, let it wander, and if you drift off somewhere in the warm middle of the evening, then the bath will have done for you exactly what an evening at the baths was always meant to do. Settle in. Let your breath slow until it matches the temperature of the water. And let us go down, together and entirely unhurried, into the long, warm quiet of the baths. The afternoon, by the time we arrive, is already past its height. In a Roman town, the working day was a short one, begun at first light and largely finished by the middle of the day, and so the long golden hours that followed belonged to other things, to errands and idleness, and, above all, to the bath. All along the street, the shadows have grown longer and softer. The heat has gone out of its sharpness and settled into something gentler. And from doorway to doorway, the people of the town are drifting without hurry, in a single loose and unspoken direction. They are going where everyone goes at this hour. They are going to wash and to sit, and to let the day come quietly to its close. The bathhouse itself gives no grand face to the street. It is a low and solid building, plainer on the outside than what it holds within, and you would know it less by its doorway than by the things that gather around it. There is the smell first, the warm and resinous smell of wood smoke, drifting from the furnace that has been burning since before noon to heat the water and the floors. There is a low and continuous sound, too, beneath the noise of the street, the sound of water and of many voices held together under a vaulted roof, softened by stone into a single warm murmur. And there is the slow coming and going at the door, the unhurried traffic of a place that the whole town passes through sooner or later on almost every day of its life. Somewhere within, at the hour when the water has come fully to its heat, a bell is rung. It is not a loud thing, only a small bronze handbell, but the town has long since learned to listen for it, and its thin round note carries out through the doorway and along the nearer streets. The poet Marshall, who knew these places well, wrote of that very sound, of the bell of the warm baths, calling the ball player to give up his game and come inside before the water cooled. And so, all around, the games begin to wind down. The catch is let drop, the score is left uncounted, and the loose crowd of the exercise yard begins, in its own slow time, to turn toward the doors and the warmth that waits behind them. For a bath, in the Roman understanding, did not begin with water at all. It began with exercise. Out here in the open courtyard, the palestra, where men came to work a little warmth and a little sweat into the body before they ever went inside. The games were unhurried and old. There was trigon, a game of catch played three-cornered, the ball thrown without warning from hand to hand. There was harpastum, rougher and more crowded, a scramble in the dust, and there was the great light follies, the inflated ball that the older men could bat gently back and forth without ever troubling their breath. None of it was urgent. It was movement for the sake of warmth, a way of loosening the day out of the limbs before surrendering them to the heat. In another corner of the yard, the heavier work went on, just as quietly. There were the lead weights, the halters, lifted and set down again in slow and even rhythm. There was a man running short and easy lengths along the colonnade, more to warm the blood than to test it, and over it all hung the fine pale dust of the palestra, raised by soft footfalls and turning gold where the low light caught it. The sweat that came was the whole purpose of the thing, for the bath that followed would draw that sweat out further and carry it away, and a body that came to the water already warm and open would give itself far more willingly to the heat than a body brought in cold from the street. At the door, the price of all this comfort was almost nothing at all. A bath cost a quadrans, the smallest copper coin the Romans minted, a quarter of a single as, so trifling a sum that to call a thing a quadrans matter was simply to call it cheap. A child went in for nothing, and in many towns some local man of means, wishing to be remembered kindly, had endowed the baths so that for days or months together they cost nothing for anyone, citizen and stranger alike. The coin was dropped into the keeping of the bathkeeper, the balneater, who held the lease of the place and sat near the entrance through the long afternoon, taking the little coins one by one as the town filed past him into the warmth. Just inside lay the changing room, the apoditerium, a plainer and cooler chamber than those that followed, where the bather left the outer world behind along with his clothes. Around the walls, set at the height of the shoulder, ran rows of open niches and recesses, each one a little square shelf of shadow, waiting to be filled with a folded tunic and a pair of street sandals. The floor underfoot was patterned in small tiles, very often in black and white, and the air held that particular cool stillness of a stone room that the heat has not yet reached. Here a man undressed without ceremony, folded what he had worn into one of the waiting niches, and stood for a moment in the cool, on the threshold of the warmth to come. Not everything about the changing room was restful, and it is only honest to admit it. For clothes left folded in an open niche were clothes left at some risk, and the bath thief was a familiar figure of Roman life, common enough that the law gave him his own name, the Fur Balnearius, the thief of the baths. A man of means would leave a slave to sit and guard his things, or would pay the small fee of the capsarius, the keeper of the clothes, whose business was to watch the niches through the afternoon. Yet even the capsarius did not always keep the cleanest hands, and more than one Roman grumbled that the watcher and the thief were now and then the very same person. It was, in the end, a small shadow over a great comfort, and most chose simply not to dwell on it. Against this small unease the bather set out his few simple instruments, the modest kit that every visit to the baths required. There was a flask of oil, olive oil, carried in a small round bottle of glass or bronze, for the Romans did not wash with soap, as we do, but anointed the body with oil and then drew it off again. There were one or two strigils, the curved metal scrapers, hung together on a ring, their thin blades shaped to follow the arm and the leg, and there were towels of linen for the warmth at the end. A wealthy man's slave would carry all of this for him and stand ready through the evening. A poorer man carried his own, a little bundle of oil and bronze and cloth, and managed, as poorer men always have, perfectly well. And all the while the room was never quite still, for the bath was a crossing place of the whole town, and every sort of person passed through it. There were men of property, and men who owned nothing but the oil in their flask, and within these walls, undressed and unadorned, they were harder to tell apart than anywhere else in Roman life. Slaves moved among them carrying flasks and folded linen. Attendants came and went on errands of their own, and the soft slap of bare feet on the patterned floor went on without pause, a quiet and continuous rhythm under the murmur of voices. No one hurried. There was nowhere in here that anyone particularly needed to be, except a little deeper in, a little closer to the warmth. From the doorway that led further in, the warmth came out to meet you. It was a soft and bodily thing, that first reach of heat, rising from a floor that was warm to the bare soul and breathing out of an inner room you could not yet see. With it came a faint and pleasant haze, the first thin edge of steam, softening the lamplight and blurring the far end of the passage into a warm gold dimness. The cool of the changing room fell away behind. The patterned floor gave way to stone that held the heat, and the body, already loosened by the exercise of the yard, leaned toward that warmth as a matter of simple instinct, the way one leans, without deciding to, toward a fire on a cold evening. And so, oiled and unburdened, with the dust of the yard still on the skin and the cool of the changing room at his back, the bather stepped through. Ahead lay the warm room, the tepidarium, where the heat was gentle and the purpose was patience, and beyond it, the greater heat, and beyond that, the water itself. There was no need to rush through any of it. The whole architecture of the place was built to be taken slowly, one warm room giving on to the next, each a little hotter than the last. so that the body might be led by easy stages out of the ordinary world and down into the long, soft, steam-softened heart of the bath. We will follow, just as slowly, and we will begin where the heat itself begins, in the quiet warmth of the tepidarium. The warm room received the body the way a warm hand receives a cold one, slowly and without any shock at all. This was the tepidarium, the first of the heated rooms, and its whole purpose was gentleness. The heat here was mild and even, held steady in the air and rising softly from the floor. Neither the cool of the changing room behind, nor the great heat that waited ahead, but a patient middle warmth in which the body could be persuaded, by degrees, to open. There was no water to bathe in here, no pool, and no basin to speak of, only the warmth itself and the low stone benches set against the walls, where a man might sit and breathe and feel the chill of the outer world begin, quietly, to leave him. The Romans understood, better than we sometimes give them credit for, that heat is best taken in stages. To step straight from the street into the fierce heat of the hottest room would have been a small violence to the body, and they had no taste for it. And so the bath was arranged as a kind of slow ascent, room giving onto warmer room, each threshold a little step deeper into the warmth, and the tepidarium was the first and gentlest of those steps. Here the bather lingered as long as he liked, doing nothing in particular, letting the warmth find its way into the shoulders and the back and the long muscles of the legs, until the body itself, rather than the mind, decided that it was ready to go on. Much of that warmth came, strange as it must have seemed to a man standing on it, from beneath the floor. The stone underfoot was warm, distinctly and pleasantly warm, warmer than the air in places, and a bather new to such things might well have wondered where the heat was hidden. It was hidden, in fact, directly below him, in a shallow and secret room of hot air that the Romans had learned to build under the floors of their baths. The whole floor of the tepidarium did not rest upon the ground at all. It was raised, lifted clear, and held up above an empty space through which the breath of a distant furnace moved unseen, warming the stone from underneath so that it gave its heat up gently, all day long, into the soles of every foot that crossed it. The Romans called this device the hippocaust, the fire beneath, and it was among the quietest marvels of their building. The raised floor stood upon a forest of little pillars, the palae, short stacks of square brick set in even rows across the underfloor space, each one no higher than the knee, and upon their tops rested the heavy tiles and the marble that the bather walked across above. Between and around these pillars, the hot air from the furnace spread and circled, filling the hidden room with heat, pressing its warmth up into the floor and outward in every direction. It was a simple idea, carried out with great care, and it asked nothing of the bather but that he stand upon it and be warmed, never seeing and never needing to see the patient brick lungs that breathed beneath his feet. Nor did the heat stay only beneath the floor, for the Romans had learned to lead it up into the walls as well. Set into the masonry, behind the smooth marble facing, ran rows of hollow box tiles, the tubuli, a network of clay flues, through which the hot air rose from the underfloor space and climbed the height of the room before escaping somewhere near the roof. The effect was that the walls themselves grew warm, gently and evenly, so that a hand laid flat against the marble felt not the cold of stone but a soft returning heat, as though the building itself were a living and warm-blooded thing. A bather could lean his back against that warmth and feel it press into him from behind, while the floor warmed him from below, and the still air warmed him all around. The source of all this gentle warmth lay out of sight, beyond the bathing rooms entirely. On the working side of the building where no bather went, there stood the furnace, the Pryfernium, a great fire mouth of brick and iron that had been lit long before the doors opened and would be fed until they closed. By it labored the men whose work the bathers never thought about and rarely saw. The furnace slaves, who carried and split and stacked the wood, who fed the flames through the long afternoon, and who lived their hours in the heat and the smoke and the red light so that the rooms beyond might stay softly and reliably warm. The bather felt only the result, the kind even heat in the floor and the wall, and never the labor. And that, perhaps, is worth a moment's quiet thought as we sit here in the warmth. The light in the warm room came mostly from above. High in the walls, set well over the heads of the bathers, ran a row of windows, some of them glazed with the thick greenish cast glass the Romans had learned to make, and through them the late daylight fell in long, soft shafts, slanting down through the warm and faintly steaming air. It was a diffuse and golden light, never sharp, broken and softened by the haze it passed through, and it lay in pale pools upon the floor and gilded the rising threads of steam. As the afternoon wore on, those shafts would lengthen and redden, and at last grow thin, and the lamps would take up the work of lighting. But for now, the room held that particular honeyed glow of a warm space lit from high windows by a sun already low. It is worth pausing, while the warmth does its work, to look at the room the Romans had made. A bath of any standing was not a plain place. The lower walls were faced with marble, panels of it fitted close and polished smooth, veined in soft browns and creams and grays. The floor was laid in mosaic, tens of thousands of small stone cubes set by hand into patterns, often in black and white, very often with the creatures of the sea, dolphins and tritons and curling waves, as though to remind the bather of water, even where the floor was dry. Above, the vaults were dressed in painted plaster and molded stucco, and here and there a fitting of bronze, a tap, a basin's rim, a lampstand, caught the light and held it. It was a place built, with real care, to be looked at as well as used. Somewhere in the warm rooms, before the heat grew fierce, came the anointing with oil. This was the work of the attendant the Romans called the unctor, or sometimes the elliptes, the man whose whole craft was the rubbing of oil into the skin. He would take the bather's flask, or his own, and pour a little of the green gold olive oil into his palm, and work it slowly over the shoulders and the arms and the back, until the skin was sleek and gleaming, and the warmth seemed to sink the deeper for it. There was nothing hurried in the motion. It was a slow and practiced kneading, half a cleansing and half a comfort, and under it the last knots of the day's tiredness were worked loose, and the body was made ready, oiled and warm and loosened, for the heat that lay ahead. The smell of the warm room gathered itself by now into something particular and unmistakable. There was the clean green scent of the olive oil, and under it the faint sweetness of whatever perfumes the wealthier bathers had brought, and under that again, the plain, honest smell of warm, wet stone, of marble that has held water and heat for hours together. A thread of wood smoke reached even here from the distant furnace, very faint, more a memory of fire than a presence of it, and through it all moved the warm, damp air itself, heavy and soft in the chest, easy to breathe, carrying its mingled scents from room to room. It was the smell of the bath, and a Roman would have known it anywhere, with his eyes closed, as the smell of the gentlest hours of his day. And so the warm room did what it was built to do. The bathers sat along its benches or stood at ease against its warm walls, and they talked, in the low and unhurried way that warmth encourages, of nothing that needed deciding, or they said nothing at all, and let the heat speak for them. The murmur of their voices rose into the vault and came back softened, blurred into the general warm hum of the place, so that no single word stood out, and the whole became a kind of slow human weather, pleasant to sit inside of. Minutes passed, and were not counted. The chill of the street was long gone now, worked out of the body by the gentle even heat, and a soft readiness took its place, a sense that the body, warmed through, might now go willingly to meet the greater heat beyond. When at last the body gave its quiet signal, the bather rose, unhurried still, and turned toward the warmer room beyond. The doorway there breathed out a heavier heat, thicker and wetter than the warmth he had been sitting in, and the steam came denser through it, curling along the floor and softening the lamplight into a near and golden fog. He had been led by easy stages to this threshold, warmed in the floor and the wall and the air, oiled and loosened and made ready, and now the true heat of the bath lay just ahead, in the room the Romans built nearest the fire. We will follow him in, slowly, as we have followed him so far, into the heat and the steam of the caldarium, where the water itself was hot and the air was thick enough to lean upon. To step into the hot room was to step into a different element altogether. The air here was thick, warm, and wet at once, and it met the body like warm water, closing softly around the chest and the shoulders, so that the first few breaths came slow and deliberate, as a man breathes who has walked into a cloud. This was the caldarium, the hot room, built nearest of all to the fire, and everything in it spoke of heat. The haze that blurred the far wall to a golden nothing, the sheen of moisture on every surface, the slow, heavy curl of the steam as it rose and gathered along the vault overhead. A bather stood a moment on the threshold to let his lungs grow used to it, and then went into the warmest heart of the bath, where the heat was no longer a comfort, merely but a presence to be reckoned with. The whole room had been arranged around its heat. It sat directly above the busiest part of the hypocaust, where the hot air from the furnace was strongest, and its windows, fewer and smaller than those of the cooler rooms, were often glazed and shut to hold the warmth inside, so that the heat gathered and stayed rather than slipping away. The marble of the walls was warm to the hand, warmer than in the room before. The floor was warm enough, in places, to make a man glad of the wooden soles beneath his feet. Everything sweated gently, the walls and the vault and the bathers alike, and the moisture ran in slow threads down the polished stone and dropped, now and then, in soft, irregular taps from the ceiling, the only clock the room kept. At one end of the hot room, set into a recess of its own, lay the great hot bath, the alveus, a long basin of heated water, raised a little above the floor and entered by a step or two of marble. The water in it was genuinely hot, fed from the boilers beside the furnace, and kept warm by the heat that rose beneath. And along its inner edge ran a broad submerged ledge, a seat of stone, where a bather could lower himself and sit half immersed in the heat for as long as he could bear it pleasantly. The surface of the water lay almost still, breathing a steady veil of steam, and a hand passed across it came away warm and wet, and the whole basin glowed faintly amber where the lamplight found it through the haze. To lower oneself into that water was to feel the heat take hold in earnest. It rose up the body by inches as a man descended the steps, ankle and knee and waist, each new depth a little fiercer than the last, until at last he settled onto the submerged ledge, and the hot water closed about his chest, and the steam wrapped his shoulders, and the heat was everywhere at once, inside the breath and against the skin, and pressing gently in upon the heart. The first moments asked a little courage, and then the body yielded, as it always does, and the fierceness softened into a deep and spreading ease, a heaviness in every limb, a loosening so complete that thought itself grew slow and warm and reluctant to move. A man might sit so for a long while, doing nothing, wanting nothing, dissolved almost wholly into the heat. When the heat of the great bath grew too much, relief stood close at hand. Set beneath the window at the other side of the room was the labrum, a wide and shallow basin of cool water raised on a single foot, a great stone bowl placed there, as Vitruvius advised, where the light from the window would fall full upon it, and no bather's shadow would darken it. From this the bather scooped cool water in his cupped hands and poured it over his face and his head and the back of his neck, and the small shock of it against the heat was a pleasure all its own, a brief bright coolness that cleared the head and steadied the breath before he gave himself back to the warmth. The water in the labrum was forever being stirred and splashed and renewed, and its quiet trickle and the soft slap of palms against its surface were among the steadiest sounds of the hot room. For those who wanted heat of a different and fiercer kind, there was another room still, smaller and drier, that the Romans called the laconicum, or sometimes the sudatorium, the sweating room. It was often a little round chamber roofed with a dome, and the heat in it was a dry and searching heat, without the wet weight of the steam rooms, a heat that drew the sweat out of the body in earnest and asked it to give up, through the skin, whatever the day had left in it. A man went into the laconicum not to wash, but simply to sweat, to sit in the fierce still dryness with the heat pressing close on every side until the perspiration ran freely from him and his whole body shone with it, and the sense of being slowly emptied and cleansed from within became almost the only thing he could feel. The heat of the sweating room could be governed, and the means of governing it was a small and clever thing. In the crown of the dome, the Romans left a round opening, a vent to the sky, and beneath it they hung a shield of bronze, a clypeus, suspended on chains. When the room grew too fierce, the bronze disc was raised, and the opening above stood clear, and the hottest air escaped. When more heat was wanted, the disc was lowered to cover the vent, and the warmth was held in. Vitruvius set the device down in his book of architecture, plainly and without fuss, as one detail among many of how a proper bath was to be made. And so the bathers, sweating quietly on their circular bench, sat beneath a slow bronze sun that some attendant raised or lowered, by a little, whenever the heat asked it of him. However a man took his heat, in the wet steam of the caldarium, or the dry stillness of the laconicum, the end of it was the same. A body thoroughly warmed and thoroughly opened, the skin damp and gleaming, the oil of the warm room now mingled with sweat and with the fine dust the day had left behind. This mixture lay upon the skin as a thin and slippery film, and it was not to be left there. It was to be drawn off, carefully and completely, and the drawing off was the true cleansing of the Roman bath, the act for which the whole long warming had been a preparation. For this the bather took up his strigil, the curved scraper of bronze, and either set to work upon himself or gave himself over to the practiced hand of an attendant who would do it for him. The scraping itself was a slow and oddly soothing business. The thin curved blade was laid flat against the skin and drawn along the limb in long, even strokes, following the line of the arm, the curve of the shoulder, the length of the leg, and before it gathered a small ridge of the oil and sweat and dust, it lifted away, which was wiped now and then from the blade and let fall. There was no haste in it. Stroke followed stroke in a steady rhythm. the metal warm and smooth against the body, the film of the day drawn off a little at a time until the skin behind the blade came up clean and faintly glowing, washed not with water, but with oil and bronze and patience. The Romans had a word for what the strigil gathered, the strigmenum, the scrapings, and thought of the whole as a cleansing more thorough than mere washing could ever be. What was scraped away was not always simply discarded. In the older Greek world, from which the Romans had taken so much of their bathing, the scrapings gathered from the bodies of athletes were collected and kept, and were thought to hold some virtue in them, some quality good for the skin or useful to the physician. And Pliny, in his great compendium of natural things, records such uses without much surprise. We need not follow the matter very far, nor believe every claim the ancients made for their remedies. It is enough to know that nothing here was wasted lightly, that even the film drawn from a tired body was thought to be worth the gathering, and that the Roman in his bath stood at the end of a very long tradition of believing that oil and warmth and the patient scraping of the skin were, together, a kind of medicine. Near the wall that backed onto the furnace, the heat reached its greatest pitch. Here the floor itself grew hot enough to trouble the bare foot, for directly beneath it the fire's breath ran strongest, and a bather crossing this part of the room was glad of the thick wooden soles that the baths provided against exactly such heat. Sandals raised on little platforms of wood that kept the skin a safe finger's breadth above the scorching stone. The marble of the seats, too, could grow uncomfortably warm where the heat gathered, and a man learned where to sit and where not to linger. It was the price of all that comfort, this fierce near edge of the fire, and it served as a quiet reminder that the gentle warmth spreading through the rooms was only the soft and distant end of something that, at its source, was very hot indeed. By now, the body had given the heat all that the heat could ask of it. The skin was clean and glowing, scraped and rinsed and thoroughly warmed, the muscles loose, the breath slow, the mind emptied of nearly everything but the sensation of being warm. And it is exactly at this point, when a man is heated through to the very center of him, that the Romans did a thing that may sound unkind, and was in truth a deep pleasure. They went to the cold. For waiting beyond the hot rooms was a third kind of water altogether, still and cold and clear, and the shock of it upon a body so thoroughly warmed was held to be the finest moment of the whole bath. We will go there now, out of the heat and the steam, into the cool, bright room of the cold plunge, the frigidarium, out of the heat then, and into the cool. The room the bather came to now was a different country from the one he had left, clearer and brighter and easier to breathe, with no steam to thicken the air and no fierce warmth pressing in. This was the frigidarium, the cold room, often the largest and the most handsome of all the bathing rooms, a high, cool hall where the marble was no longer warm to the touch, but pleasantly, cleanly cold, and where the light, falling from broad windows, lay sharp and pale upon the floor instead of dissolving into golden haze. After the close, warm dimness of the hot rooms, it felt almost like stepping out of doors, and a man paused on its threshold simply to feel the cool air move across his warmed and gleaming skin. At the heart of the cold room lay the cold water itself. In a grand establishment, this might be a great open swimming basin, the natatio, wide enough to take many bathers at once. In a more modest town bath, it was a smaller plunge, the piscina, a basin of cold, clear water lined with marble and set down a few steps into the floor. Either way, the water was unheated, drawn cool from the cisterns and the pipes, and it lay very still and very clear. So clear that the pattern of the mosaic on its floor could be read through it, wavering faintly where the surface stirred. No steam rose from it. It simply waited, cold and bright and patient, a still mirror of the high windows above, for the warmed bathers to come down to it and break its quiet. The plunge itself was a small and deliberate shock, and the Romans loved it precisely for that. A body heated through and through, loose and heavy with warmth, came down the cold steps and into the cold water, and for a moment the cold seized it entirely, sharp and bright and total, driving the breath inward and waking every nerve at once. And then, almost as quickly, the shock passed and turned into its opposite. The skin, which had been open and slack with heat, drew tight and firm. The heaviness lifted, and in its place rose a clean, tingling briskness, a sense of being thoroughly and completely awake and alive, cool to the center and yet still warm beneath. It was the hinge of the whole bath, this passage from the deepest heat to the keenest cold, and a Roman would have told you, with some conviction, that there was no better feeling to be had for the price of a quadrans. Out of the cold water the bother came renewed, and an attendant or a slave was there with the linen. The towels of a Roman bath were of plain woven cloth, and the drying was unhurried. The cool, clean skin patted and wrapped and rubbed gently warm again, until the last of the water was gone, and the body settled into a temperate, even ease, neither hot nor cold, but balanced comfortably between the two. This was the bath complete, the whole circuit closed, the warming, the heat, the sweat, the scraping, and now the cold and the drying, each step laid in its proper order, each leaving the body a little further from the dust and the tiredness of the day. What remained was not really bathing at all. What remained was the part the Romans may have loved best of all, the long, unhurried lingering, the sitting and the talking in the cool, bright hall with the evening coming on. For the bath, in the end, was never only a place to wash. It was the great common room of the Roman town, the place where, day after day, the whole population came together with nothing pressing to do, and the cool hall of the frigidarium was where most of that easy human business unfolded. Men sat along its benches and stood in loose knots beneath its vaults, wrapped in linen, warmed and idle, and they talked of everything and of nothing, of prices and lawsuits, and the doings of their neighbors, of the chances of the games and the affairs of the distant capital. Friendships were kept up here, and bargains struck, and the long, slow gossip of a small place passed from mouth to mouth. The serious world, with its ranks and its hurries, was left outside with the street clothes, and what remained was a warm, unhurried, talkative ease. Through this easy crowd moved the sellers of small comforts, calling their wares in the practiced sing-song of the market. There was food to be had at the baths, simple things suited to idle hands, and an hour before dinner, and we know something of what was sold, because at one bath, at Herculaneum, a list of such things survives. There were nuts to crack and eat, and bread, and cuts of pork, and sausages, and cheaper morsels for the poorer purse, and drink to wash them down. The seller carried his tray among the benches, naming each thing in turn, and the bathers reached up to him without rising, and the soft business of eating and paying threaded itself through the talk. It was not a feast, only a handful of warm and salty pleasures to fill the gap between the bath and the evening meal, but it belonged to the place as surely as the water did. Among the bathers worked the masseurs, the same craft of oil and hands that had anointed the body before the heat, now turned to the kneading of tired limbs. A man would stretch himself upon a bench and give his back and his shoulders over to the practiced hands of the attendant, and the rubbing would begin, slow and firm and rhythmic. The oil worked deep, The knots of the day pressed slowly out. Now and then the flat of the hand came down upon the skin in a soft, open clap, a sound that rang and changed its note as the hand struck cupped or level, and this steady percussion, half massage and half music, carried across the hall and mingled with the talk and the calling of the cellars. Under such hands, a man might drift to the very edge of sleep, loose-limbed and warm and barely present, which was, after all, very near the whole point of the thing. Not every service of the baths was so gentle to the ear. There was, among the attendants, the hair plucker, the man whose narrow trade was the removing of unwanted hair from the bodies of those who wished it gone, and he advertised himself, as such men did, with a high and carrying cry, naming his service over and over above the murmur of the hall. It was a thin and piercing sound, and it fell silent only at the moment of its work, when the customer under his hand gave a short yelp of his own, and the cry passed, for an instant, from the seller to the served. Seneca, who heard all of this through his floor and disliked nearly every part of it, set the hair plucker's cry down as among the worst of his trials. To us, at this distance, it is merely one more thread in the strange, rich braid of sound that filled a Roman bath, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, only wholly and unmistakably of its place. It is worth lingering a moment on that braid of sound, for it is one of the few things from a Roman bath that has come down to us almost whole. Seneca, the philosopher, once lodged in rooms set directly above a public bath, and in a letter to a friend he wrote out, half in complaint and half in wonder, everything that he was made to hear. There was the grunting of the men who lifted the lead weights, and the wheeze of their breath let out. There was the slap of the masseur's hand. There was the splash of the man who slipped into the plunge. There was the fellow who loved the sound of his own voice and sang in the echoing bath. There was the brawler's noise and the rattle of the pickpocket caught. There was the hair plucker's cry and the calls of the sellers of cakes and sausages and sweets, each in his own distinct note. Seneca heard a torment in it. We may hear something gentler, the sound of a place entirely, contentedly alive. And in all that noise and ease there was something the Romans themselves half noticed and half took for granted, which was that the bath, more than almost any other place in their world, set its people level with one another. A man stripped of his clothes is stripped, too, of much that marks his station, and in the warm water and the cool hall the senator and the shopkeeper and the freedman shared the same benches, breathed the same steam, and waited their turn at the same basins. The distinctions did not vanish entirely, for nothing human ever does. The rich still came trailing their slaves, and the poor still came alone. But for an hour or two, in the warm democratic fog of the baths, the hard edges of ranks softened, and the town met itself, undressed and unhurried, as something nearer to a single body than it ever managed to be out in the bright and grated street. While all of this went on, the light had been quietly changing. The broad windows of the cold hall, which had been full of pale gold, were dimming now toward a deeper amber, and the shafts that crossed the room had grown long and low and red, and thinned, and begun to fade. The afternoon was spending itself, and as the daylight failed, here and there about the rooms the lamps were being lit, the little bronze lamps with their single wicks, carried from niche to niche by an attendant with a taper, each one waking a small warm flame in the gathering dimness. One by one the pale daylit rooms turned golden again, lit now from within rather than from above, and the whole great building began its slow change of mood, from a place of the afternoon to a place of the evening, warm and shadowed and lamplit, with the night coming on outside its walls. The bath, for most of the town was nearly done. The circuit was complete, the body washed and warmed and cooled and dried, the talk grown slow, the food eaten, the light gone from the windows. There was a softness over everyone now, the particular heavy contentment of a body well bathed at the end of a day, and one by one, in no hurry at all, the bothers began to think of their clothes and their suppers, and the walk home through the cooling streets. The great rooms, so full and so loud an hour before, would empty by slow degrees as the evening deepened, until only the lamplight and the stilling water and the last few lingerers remained. We will stay a little longer than they do, to the very end, and watch the bath let its bathers go and settle, room by room, into the quiet of the night. And now the long emptying begins. One by one, and then in little drifting groups, the bathers gather their flasks and their folded linen and make their unhurried way back toward the changing room and the street, and the rooms they leave behind grow quieter behind them, room by room, as the evening settles in. The voices thin, the calling of the cellars falls away. The slap of feet on the warm stone comes less and less often, and the long warm hum that filled the place all afternoon loosens and softens and begins to come apart into single separate sounds. A far door, a low word, the trickle of water somewhere, each one standing alone now in the gathering quiet where before there had been only the warm and seamless murmur of the crowd. For the bath, in most towns, kept the hours of the sun. It opened in the early afternoon and it closed as the daylight failed, and to bathe on into the full dark was, for most Romans in most places, a thing simply not done, less from any rule than from the plain fact that the rooms were lit for the most part by their windows, and when the windows went dark, the reason for staying went with them. There were exceptions in the great city, in grand times. It is remembered that one emperor once gave oil enough for the public baths of Rome to burn their lamps and stay open into the night, where before they had always closed before the lamps were lit. But that was a rare imperial generosity, a luxury of the capital, and not the way of an ordinary town bath, which now, as the light goes, is doing only what it has always done, and beginning, gently, to close. On the working side of the building, where the bathers never went, the great fire was being let down at last. All afternoon the furnace slaves had fed it, splitting and stacking and pushing the wood into the fire mouth to keep the water hot and the floors warm. And now, with the rooms emptying, the feeding slowed and stopped. No more wood was added. The high flames sank, by slow degrees, into a deep bed of glowing coals, and the coals began their own long fading, settling and dimming and graying at the edges, giving up their heat more gently now, with no fresh fuel to drive them. The fierce red light of the furnace softened to a low and pulsing amber, and the men who had tended it stood back from the warmth they had made and let it begin, like everything else in the building, to cool toward the night. In the bathing rooms the water grew still. All afternoon it had been stirred and broken, splashed and weighted and poured, the surfaces forever moving, forever catching and scattering the light. And now, with no one left to trouble them, the pools settled slowly back into stillness. The last ripples spread and widened and met the marble edges and died, and the water came to rest, flat and dark and quiet. A black glass laid across each basin, holding on its motionless face the single small reflection of a lamp. In the hot bath, a faint last warmth still breathed a thread of steam into the cooling air. In the cold plunge, the surface lay perfectly unmoving, and from somewhere, in the new quiet, came the sound that the crowd had drowned all day, and that belonged truly to the night. The slow and patient sound of a single drop of water falling and falling again onto wet and waiting stone. Through the dimming rooms, the attendants moved now in their last slow round, doing the quiet work of closing. They gathered the forgotten things, the flask left on a bench, the towel dropped by a doorway, the stray strigil. They swept the worn floors with their soft brooms, the bristles whispering across the stone. They wiped the basins and set the benches straight and carried away what needed carrying away. There was no hurry in any of it, and very little sound, only the whisper of the brooms and the small clink of gathered bronze and the occasional low word between one man and another in the half-dark. It was work they had done 1,000 times and would do 1,000 times again. The same unremarkable closing of the same unremarkable evening, and they did it gently, almost tenderly, the way one moves quietly about a room where someone has just fallen asleep. And all the while the building itself was cooling, very slowly, all through its great stone body. The marble of the floors, which had been warm to the bare foot all afternoon, gave its warmth up now by patient degrees, the heat sinking back down through the empty hypocaust toward the dying fire. The walls, which had breathed their soft heat into the rooms, cooled inward through their hidden flues. The vaults gave back the last of their gathered warmth to the still air. There was nothing sudden in it. A great mass of warmed stone lets go of its heat, the way a great thing always does, slowly and over a long time, so that the rooms would stay faintly warm for hours, far into the night, long after the last lamp was carried out, cooling so gradually that no single moment could be named as the one in which the warmth was finally gone. The hot rooms, an hour ago so thick with steam and voices, stood empty now and almost clear. The haze had thinned and lifted, and very nearly gone, drawn off into the cooling air, and the great hot bath, the alveus, lay still in its recess, breathing only the faintest last thread of warmth from its darkening water. The cool basin under the window, the labrum, sat full and motionless, no hand to stir it now. The bronze disk hung quiet beneath its dome, and over all of it lay the soft and even light of the few lamps left burning, a low gold light that found the wet sheen of the marble and the dark still faces of the pools, and gave them back, dimly, doubled, so that each quiet room seemed to hold a second quiet room within its water, lamplit and empty and perfectly at rest. Listen now to how little is left to hear. The voices are gone, the sellers are gone, the slap of the hand and the cry of the plucker and the splash of the plunge are all gone, carried out into the streets with the bathers who made them. What remains is very small and very old and very patient. There is the slow drip of water onto stone, somewhere in the dark, falling and falling again. There is the faint settling tick of cooling marble. There is the low hiss and shift of the dying coals, far off on the working side. And there is the small, steady breath of the lamp flames, leaning and straightening in the still air. That is all. That is the whole of the sound of the bath at night. And it is the sound, very nearly, of silence itself. The kind of silence a body can sink into the way it sinks into warm water. And then, at the last, the lamps themselves begin to go. An attendant moves through the cooling rooms with the same slow round as before, but this time he is carrying the dark, putting out the little flames one by one as he passes, or lifting the lamps from their niches to bear them away. Behind him, room by room, the gold light fails and the shadow comes in to fill the space it leaves, and each room he has passed through falls quietly and completely dark. The marble unseen now, the still water unseen, the whole warm and patient body of the bath returning, chamber by chamber, to the deep and even darkness it had held before the first bather of the afternoon ever came. He carries the last lamp toward the door. The light goes with him, and the rooms he leaves behind keep nothing of the day but their fading warmth and their soft, slow dripping in the dark. So the bath is left alone with the night, the doors barred. The street outside grows quiet under the early stars, and within, in the dark, the great stone rooms keep their long, slow vigil of cooling, asking nothing, holding nothing but warmth and shadow and the soft sound of water. The pools lie black and still. The marble cools beneath its own weight of dark. The coals settle and gray and at last go cold. And the warmth of the whole long afternoon, the warmth of the fire and the water and the many quiet bodies, drains away so gently and so slowly into the night that there is no moment of its leaving, only a deepening of the stillness, a settling toward rest, the same settling toward rest that is reaching you now, wherever you are lying in the dark, as the warm rooms and the still water and the falling drop grow further and further away, and the drop of water falls, again, onto the wet dark stone, and the small ring spreads and fades, and the warm marble cools, again, by one slow degree, and then by another, and somewhere a last coal settles in its bed of ash, with a faint and final sigh. The bath has done this on 1,000 nights before this one, and will do it on 1,000 nights after. The same slow closing, the same fading warmth, the same patient dripping in the dark, year upon year, emperor upon emperor, while the town sleeps around it, and the stars wheel slowly over its silent roof. There is nothing here that needs you to be awake for it. There is nothing here to remember, and nothing to keep. There is only the warmth, going slowly out, and the water, falling, and the long dark quiet, holding it all gently until the morning. Rest now. The fire is out, and the water is still, and the warm stone is giving the last of its heat, so slowly, to the dark. There is nothing left to do here, and nothing left to watch, and nowhere at all that you need to be. Let the bath grow quiet around you. Let the warmth carry you down, the way it carried the whole town down through the long gold afternoon, into ease, and then into deeper ease, and then into sleep. The drop falls and falls again, far away now. The last warmth fades, and the night closes, soft and complete and kind, over the still water and the cooling stone, and over you and over everything, until the morning comes and the fire is lit once more. Sleep well. The archive will keep, and so will the warm and patient dark. You've reached the end of tonight's archive. If you're still awake, thank you for staying. And if you drifted off somewhere in the dark, then it did its work. Rest now. The next chapter will be here when you are. Sleep well. This has been Archive Whispers.